Welcome to episode 5 of Neighborhood Bookstore, an author interview podcast. Each episode, we take a book from an author's back catalog and chat with them about its creation. On this episode, bestselling author David Morrell.
There's something about the past that intrigues me, and if we could have a time travel machine, I'd do it, except I'd make sure I had plenty of inoculations for every kind of disease you could imagine.
Hello, everybody, and welcome to Neighborhood Bookstore, an author interview podcast. With me today hosting is Craig Duster. Hi, Craig.
Hi, how you doing?
I'm doing well. As always, I'm Eric Harper, your host, and our guest today is David Morrell. Welcome, David.
Hi.
Well, David, by way of introduction, we're going to embarrass you a little bit, all right?
Go ahead.
Craig, would you do the honors?
Absolutely. Today's guest is best-selling author David Morrell, whose novel First Blood introduced Rambo to the world. The character became a cultural touchstone. His spy thriller, The Brotherhood of the Rose, was made into a television miniseries and likely contributed DNA to such successors as the John Wick films. His novel Creepers, which we're discussing today, is currently in production as an independent feature film. Throughout his career, he has written everything from horror to adventure fiction, westerns, and Victorian mysteries. Welcome to the bookstore, David.
That's a heck of a list. It's when you put it that way. It's no wonder my agent wonders who's going to be calling from year to year.
Well, David, I want to just extend an extra thank you for being here, because you are in some part an inspiration for this podcast. Back when I was in high school, I was driving to class one day, and I heard you on the radio interviewed by Gordon Elliott about your novel, The Fifth Profession, when it came out. And that was the first time I had ever heard an author, interviewed on the radio. And it kind of lit a fire in me. I just thought, well, why can't I talk to authors and find out what they're thinking and how their trade works?
Yes.
So thank you for being here.
Oh, you're very welcome. And we did a little conversation before the show, and one of the things we were talking about was that authors often, when they're talking about what they're writing, they resort to plot summary. And I think that's not what listeners want to hear. And that I have a theory that every book has a nonfiction subject behind the fiction. In the case of Fifth Profession, it was executive protectors. And so I could talk for a long time about my training with executive protectors and the whole philosophy. It's almost Japanese, in which you are protecting somebody you might not know and you might not even care about, but your profession is the protection itself. And I thought that was when I wrote 3 protective agent novels, and that was what was in the back of my mind, that ethic that goes beyond the personal connection.
You're kind of a famous researcher of your books. And I don't just mean in the intellectual sense. I mean, I know that you have studied executive protection. I know you studied like wilderness survival and mountaineering, firearms, defensive driving, and the like. So since Creepers, which I have right here, is a book, a thriller centered around urban exploration, I guess I'm wondering, how did Urbex cross your radar, and what kind of research did you have to do?
Well, I'd always been interested in old buildings. I've often said, my wife and I joke about this. I have a much less means at my disposal, but if I had another choice as a career, I would buy wonderful old houses that really appealed to me, that had a character, and return them to what they were, and then sell them. I don't think what kind of career can you have doing that, at least with my personality. But I'd always been interested in old buildings, and where I lived when I was young, there were many old buildings that I was able to get into. And I remember on one occasion it was an old apartment building, and what people don't understand is often when these buildings are closed, they remain as they were. And I went in and the kitchen table was there and the old refrigerator unplugged was there. And what interested me was that there was an old wind up record player with 78 RPM discs. And I still remember I played one, and I still remember the song about how romance is breaking up that old gang of mine.
Oh,
Anyhow, this was in the back of my mind when in the local newspaper, we have a wonderful independent newspaper called the Santa Fe New Mexican. And it's not affiliated with any of the larger chains which dictate what can go in it or the length of the articles. And so the newspaper, while it handles some international and national stories, there's a lot of local stuff. And anyhow, they did a piece about something I didn't know about called urban explorers. And I thought when I learned about it that these were clubs I went online to see how popular it was, and I found 250,000 websites. I couldn't believe this. In fact, 250,000 websites was part of the pitch I made to my publisher. How can you go wrong publishing a book where you have 250,000 sites, never mind the members who are interested in this
right.
topic? So I did my customary intellectual research in this case and went to the websites and saw what they were doing, and in fact interviewed a couple of urban explorers who were well known within that group,
Right.
and I got more and more fascinated, and also because it's the way I think. Going back in time, which has an occasion been a theme in my books. I did a novel called Testament where it starts now and somebody's on the run and he winds up in an old ruin of a ghost town from the 1800s. And as he keeps running, he's living in a cave. It's as if he regressed in human evolution. And the same thing I thought with, going back in time or going deeper into the psyche at the same time. So those were the metaphors that I was playing with as I was putting the book together, and well, it appealed to me in a way. It's seldom you get a plot that allows you to go in so many subtextual. I'm really talking like an author now. Subtextual directions.
Well, for people who haven't read the book, could you just give us a very simple description of the plot?
It is set in, and I said I wouldn't do this, but because you asked me, I'm
Yep.
going to do it.
I appreciate it.
It's set in Atlantic, and not Atlantic City. In come on, where's it set? No, it's been so long ago.
Asbury Park.
Asbury Park, and at the time when I wrote the book, Asbury Park was a war zone in effect. It was a lot of ruined buildings, and its main claim to fame was that. It had a music scene. The thing that interested me was that the whole town's a ruin. Now that has changed. If you went to Asbury Park today, it was since that book was published in 2005, the town has been rejuvenated. And what I was going to say earlier is Bruce Springsteen is noted for Asbury Park. But at the time it was a wreck. The building and the town itself, and it had been a glory day. At one time, it had been a magnificent beach resort. And so I thought, all right, I'm gonna pick a building there. It's a fictional one, but it's based on a number of old hotels that were there. And it's going to have been closed since the mid 1960s. And it will have been built at the turn of the century. So there's a lot of history. And as with so many of these buildings, when it was closed, mysteriously, it was all left inside the way it had been.
Yeah, it is something of a time capsule.
Exactly, which became the subject of the next novel that I wrote, Scavenger. That these topics really interested me, and it's about a team that goes into that. One's a professor and he has some students, and there's a mysterious man named Ballinger who claims to be a reporter, but is something else, and then we find out he's something else yet again. I love the idea of a man changing 3 times in the course of the story. And they go into, they have to do it through, as it were, the sewers,
Mhm.
because the place is boarded up, and these places are patrolled because they're unsafe.
Mhm.
So a true urban explorer crew will have, thick-soled construction boots. They'll be wearing the construction equipment, and they'll have utility belts and all that. And they will have with them methane detectors and carbon monoxide detectors and things of that sort. And so, they're like urban guerrillas in a way. And so they go in through the tunnels to the hotel, and then the plot is basically what happens in that night. And one of the things that occurred to me, I love various challenges, and one of the things that occurred to me is that the book would occur within an 8-hour span, as it were, from dusk till dawn. And the novel would be divided into like 9 to 10, 10 to 11, 11 to 12, and so on. And as near as I could time it, that it would take at a moderate pace an hour to read each section. And the time would be continuous. It's a technique called real time, so that every instant of every breath of 8 hours is on the page. The standard way this is done is 5 minutes later he did whatever, but those 5 minutes are on the page. Every step that they go up on a staircase is on the page. If they have to relieve their bladder, that's in the book too.
I was going
Uh,
to comment on that, that a lot of, like, when I think of real time, I think of movies and television. I haven't really encountered that concept used in a book before, but one of the elements that stood out to me is the fact that, characters do have to stop and use the bathroom.
yeah,
It really does account for every one of their actions.
yes, and quite a challenge, and I was very gratified. Brilliance Audio did the audio book, and the running time for the audio book is almost 8 hours. So it takes 8 hours to read the book out
It
loud,
worked.
and this is for any writers listening. I was always impressed by Edgar Allan Poe's theory of the philosophy of composition. It's an essay that he's well known for. And he had a theory that the short story in fiction was the more authentic, more reliable form of fiction than the novel, because the short story could be appreciated, it could be experienced in an hour, let us say, whereas a novel couldn't be. And he had a theory that 1 hour was more or less the duration of the average person's attention span.
Oh, wow.
So that, um, and if you think about it in terms of the novel, so you're reading along, and the novelist might have, as I try, might have tried for all this unity and all this cascading, building and cascading of effects, but you can't tell when the phone's going to ring. You can't tell when somebody's going to knock on the door, or when you have to get in the car to go somewhere, or you're reading at night and you fall asleep. There's no way to measure the pace of reading a novel. And that's why sometimes if we reread a novel, it can be a different experience, because the chunks that we appreciate it in are different, and it has a
Hmm.
different pace.
Oh, how interesting.
And so all that stuff was going on in my mind. So I thought, all right, the advantage of Creepers with its 8 hours of 1 hour sections is that I can sort of dictate the degree of attention that the reader is going to give to the sections of the book. And I'm sure everybody does this that I know of. You're reading along and you feel a little tired. How much is left in the section?
Yep.
So you page ahead. Now I tend to write, because I've written film scripts as well. Film scripts rely on sight, and books should rely on multi-senses, so they're different.
Mhm.
But scenically, I like the idea that if a scene is occurring and they say, let's go out and talk about this some more, that there's a break and a new section begins as when they're outdoors, as you would in a film script.
Mhm.
So I tend to have sections of a book which are no longer, say, than 2 or 3 pages, which would be an enormous amount in a film script, but that are only 2 or 3 pages, and then there's a break, and then there might be 2 or 3 pages, and then a break, and then there's the hour section, so that in a way I could control the pace with which people read the book. And if I did it right, I could more or less depend upon them to finish 9 to 10 before they shut the lights off.
Wow. That's not the kind of attention that I typically think of being brought to a book. That's really
Well,
impressive.
you have to remember I was a professor. I taught American literature at the University of Iowa. Not in the workshop. I didn't teach fiction. I taught literature. And this is sort of the way I think, that when I'm working on a book, I did my PhD dissertation on a contemporary American author named John Barth, who is extremely intellectual in his approach. But I learned an enormous amount from him, and a lot of the principles that he applied to the way he writes, I apply too. And this is just the way I think of it. I say, all right, here's the idea. Now, what can I do with it? Not just
Mhm.
plot wise, but what can I do? Like we alluded earlier to a book called A Scavenger. We didn't mention the title, I don't think, but with Scavenger, which is the sequel to Creepers and is about a time capsule. And in it, I thought that I would use video games as the metaphor for the structure. So there are 9 levels to the novel, imitating 9 levels of a video game. And to move from one level to the other in the plot, the characters have to solve a riddle and overcome a physical obstacle.
Wow.
And that became the structural point for that novel. So in each of the books that I write, I have this little thing in my head. Part of it keeps me interested, because if I know the story, and also there's an organizing principle, so it isn't just one damn thing after another.
Right. Well, regarding Creepers, I, as I'm curious as to whether you view it as a thriller, a mystery, a horror novel, or what, because I would describe it as Straw Dog if
Ah,
it was written by Agatha Christie or Alistair
okay.
MacLean.
Yeah, that's cool. And Sam Peckinpah's, at the top of my favorite directors.
Oh,
I when I wrote First Blood, I'd seen The Wild Bunch. I never got over The Wild Bunch, and this
Mhm.
Peckinpah's approach to writing action is very much in First Blood. Um, Maybe it's the way my mind works, but I tend to try to bring a lot of elements together. And if you had to say to me, what is it? Pick one category. It's non-supernatural horror, but it's also a mystery, and it's also a thriller. But if we have a hierarchy, the top would have to be that it's a horror novel, and the Horror Writers of America, or Horror Writers Association, that's what they used to be called, of America. The horror writers gave me a Bram Stoker Award, not for Creepers.
oh,
So
wow.
I have three awards from horror writers.
Well, the Paragon Hotel in Creepers is probably um it it's as ominous and foreboding
Yes.
building in a book I've read. I mean, it's right up there with the Overlook Hotel in The Shining.
Oh, thank you.
Is it
Mhm.
Is it based on a real building?
It is not. There were doing the research and looking at Asbury Park at the time, because it's all different now. I mean, if you went there, you'd have a very satisfying experience. But at the time, there was, in fact, though, a building that was an apartment building that was never completed. And it had a steel girder hanging down its side, which in a wind would cause it to clang against the side of the building. And you'll recall from reading Creepers that it's like the tolling of doom in the background. They keep hearing this clang, but that was a real building. And that's the only, because it was new, whereas the Paragon Hotel, as I said, was built in the turn of the century. And that building with the hanging girder was eventually blown up. They
Oh
just
boy.
out of it, demolished. That was the end of that. But so that was as close as I had to a real building. And I did, a survey looking at other buildings in Asbury Park, but nothing equaled what this was.
Right.
The age and the feeling of reminds me. I was, you have to go out and promote books and demean yourself by, buy my book. And I was somewhere, I don't know where it was. And guy came up to me, and it was in an airport. I remember I was doing a signing at an airport. And, and I came to him, he says, I've got a plane to catch. Why should I buy this book? Well, I said, do you like furniture? I don't know why I said this. And he said, I love furniture. Must have been mind melding. And I said, well, Art Deco furniture is all through this novel. So if you want to learn a little bit about Art Deco, he says, I love Art Deco. Where do I buy the book? And off he ran to the plane. Okay. That was talk about coincidental. I don't even want to mention furniture.
It seems like in reading your books, many of them have some many of them have some combination of suspense, horror, mystery,
Mhm.
and history.
Yes.
The Brotherhood of the Rose goes back centuries to establish its theme before you get into the spy fiction portion. What is it about those themes that speak to you so much?
Well, again, it's probably the way my mind works, but I tend to, if there's proof in reincarnation, I must be a reincarnated soul, because I can't get enough of the past. And in fact, when Ballinger in Creepers has been traumatized, and his psychiatrist told him that he had to erase the modern world from him, so that the only things only films, only books, only music he was allowed to experience were pre-Second World War. And I thought, how fascinating. And I wound up in later, when I did my Victorian mystery thrillers, Murder is a Fine Art, Inspector of the Dead, and Ruler of the Night, because I wanted to make people feel they were in fact there. I did there's a Richard Matheson film called Somewhere in Time, which is based upon a novel called Time and Again. And in it, a character concentrates so hard that he goes back to the turn of the century. And I was doing the same thing when I did the Victorian books for 2 years. The only books I read were related to 1850s London and my real main character, a man named Thomas de Quincey, who invented the concept of the subconscious. And I read all of his works, and there's a ton of them, several times, because I wanted to use his writing in the dialogue. So when he speaks in the books, that is in fact what he said, so to speak, in print. And also, the Victorian mood, and also I I felt I was there. So while I've traveled far from Creepers here, it's there's something about the past that intrigues me. And if we could have a time travel machine, I'd do it, except I'd make sure I had plenty of inoculations for every kind of disease you could imagine.
Is there a hidden meaning in the fact that the characters in Creepers start basically underground and their journey is up, up, up through the building?
Yeah. Yeah. And again, this is, how do you, and in terms of films, it'd be the same way. How do you structure a book so that you go through different levels of interest? That Act 1, Act 2, Act 3 is an obvious one. And so that's the place to go. You start underground and then move up. And as you move higher, revelations begin to occur. So I think of I'm a thriller writer, but I'm very aware of metaphors. And when I'm working out a structure for a book, I think of it in terms of its metaphoric values. And I think also that even though a reader might not be aware of it, readers would feel it, that that going higher becomes more intense, and then in the climax, of course, down they go again, because that's the way life is, so to speak.
Oh yeah. Well, and it is part of the tension in Creepers, because in the hotel, the way it's constructed, each floor is smaller than the one below it.
Yes.
So they're literally getting squeezed as they go.
Isn't that wonderful? I mean, it's so much fun to, it's a pyramid, and as they get higher, yes, it gets that way. And there's another element to the book. The most of the book, except for the first hour, is in the dark. They have lanterns, they have flashlights and things of that nature. So the task becomes that you cannot rely on a sense of sight. And that you then, as the book gets more dark, so to speak, you have to rely on the other senses. And I go back to John Barth, who was not only a great novelist, he's still alive. I shouldn't use the past tense, but was a great teacher. And he had a theory which I adhere to, which is about using senses in a form of what he called triangulation, so that if you're looking for a radio signal, one direction won't do it. You need another one over here to intercept, to know where the sound is coming from. So, and he said that you should have in your scenes, and you don't want to do it heavily. It has to be so the reader is not aware of it, but it is there, to use 3 senses in every scene. So when I get to Creepers, I can't use sight any longer except for the flashing lights.
Oh my
So
goodness.
sound and touch being the most powerful, and sound being a form of touch, and then and the rest of them, that in effect the whole book is triangulated for a multi-sensory experience, not using sight. And so that it's an odd book in a number of ways, that it is strictly 8 hours with no interruptions, and that it's 4 senses, not 5 senses.
Wow.
I mean, again, it's very interesting to write a book like that, as you're following a very different path. And when I teach writing, I go to conferences and I teach writing periodically, and people get very upset with me when I say that the first person, which Creepers is not, but that the first person is a trap for the unwary, because it feels so natural, so to speak, that the narrator is just as the author, so yatter, 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 yatter. First of all, first person novels by untrained writers tend to be very wordy.
Mhm.
But beyond that, and I don't know why this is, but most, even by professional writers, most first-person novels rely almost entirely on the sense of sight. And to the degree that you do that, to that degree, you have a one-dimensional novel. So that's why most first persons feel thin, because they're all sight.
Oh, that is a fascinating take that I had not considered. It reduces it more like to the experience of watching a TV show.
Yes, exactly. And as we see it, what people are describing what they're seeing, not what they're experiencing. I mean, and you wouldn't believe I mean, people get furious at me when I talk this way because, of course, it's so easy to write first person, but it isn't if you know what you're doing. And they're, oh boy, this is fun writing. I mean, what? There's no problem with writing. Well, there is if you're writing bad first persons, and oh, they get absolutely incensed. So I say, okay, do what you want.
This is like I'm fascinated because this is not a topic I've really ever heard addressed by an author, and I'll be very curious to see how an audience of readers reacts to this episode. Because
Well,
like, what you're describing is like the kind of literary criticism that's supposed to be invisible to the reader.
yeah, well, that's right. Because you don't want to tip your hand. So, and you wouldn't, in my descriptions, I very seldom have overt descriptions. Not no block paragraph about. I mean, occasionally, if it's necessary, if I have no other choice, I surrender to my weakness. But otherwise, when I do the triangulation, and I try to do it in every scene, and it's not heavy, but to put in a proper place, the reader will feel. People often say to me, "Oh, reading your novels is just like watching a movie," and I don't say anything, but the fact is, no, because movies are sight and sound. And what you're doing is you're feeling the story. And it is because of that triangulation, that multi-dimension, multi-sense, that there's a feeling of extra reality that a book normally doesn't have, especially when you have an all a sight first person narrative.
Sure. You know, to let me ask you this though. To what degree do you think a reader might find that additional immersion in the senses overwhelming? So like for example, you've written the Victorian mysteries, right?
Mhm.
So like obviously, there's sight, there's touch, there's things like that. But historical settings are full of other things that modern people don't have to deal with, like
Yes,
feces in the street
yes.
and, you know, sickness and putrefaction and constant aroma of animals. Um, how do you think people react to that?
Well, you have to, I mean, one doesn't want to discuss the reader. So, right. So you have to be delicate about that. But I mean, some of the scenes in the first De Quincey book, first Victorian book, Murders of Fine Art, what isn't widely known, but I learned because I was doing so much research, is that part of the garbage pickup in Victorian London was with wild pigs, and they ate all the garbage and
Oh,
all the offal and everything that was, and they roamed. But so if you were in the wrong part of town at the wrong time at night, you might encounter some wild pigs that thought you might be supper.
Oh boy.
And there's a scene after at the start of the novel, after they find that novel is based upon a series of mass murders in 1811 in London, which are recreated in the novel. And those mass murders were so shocking that they literally paralyzed London. In fact, paralyzed all of England, because for the first time with the mail coach system, you could have newspapers and magazines all through the UK within 36 hours. and it just shut down everything. It was so shocking. And anyhow, the two Scotland Yard detectives, Scotland Yard just recently having been organized to deal with the attempts to assassinate Queen Victoria, that's why it was established. They arrive and they have footprints that they need to analyze, and they think they're so wonderful because they have plaster casts that they're going to put in. But and of course De Quincey comes along and begins talking to them about the chasms of the human mind, and they don't know what the hell he's talking about, but they soon will. In any case, they pour the plaster, and now it's midnight, and there's no lights, and one of the Scotland Yard detectives has to make sure that nobody messes with the plaster casts, and here come the pigs.
Oh no.
And he is all by himself. He's got two chores. One is to stay alive, and the other is to keep the damn pigs away from the. So, I mean, it's so here we have darkness.
Yep.
We have the smell of the. I don't know. This technique works in any situation. The advantage of writing the Victorian books was that was so weird back then compared to what we understand, but none of the novelists at the time were aware of how weird it was. So the really strange stuff, Dickens didn't put in his novels that arsenic was in the green dye in women's clothing, that they were wearing poison. And that he didn't put in his books that the average woman in 1850, the well-to-do, with her hoop dress and all that, her clothes weighed 43 pounds. But he took this for granted. So what I was doing was trying to get reading. Oh my heavens! I wrote on it over here. You can't see it. There's a whole shelf of, to find out these weird things, which nobody knew about except the Victorians back then, and to use them in the book to create a freshness. For example, if you went into a doctor's office, there would be a roll of felt, and the laundries took the felt that they made that resulted from laundering, what we have in the dryer. We throw that felt out. But they had vast quantities of it, and they made rolls of it, which were used as towels in homes for disposing. And those rolls of felt would be in a doctor's office. And after he examined you, if he washed his hands, he'd tear off some felt. And
wow. So they like what was essentially our dryer lint. They were taking it and they were using it.
And they were using it. They were multi-purposing.
Wow.
I mean, isn't that cool?
It's very cool.
And so now if you set a novel today, that's one of the reasons why I had fun with Creepers, because the novel it had been boarded up since 1965. So, what we take for granted back, and then what's more, the furnishings went back to the 30s. And the architecture went back to, so that everything was different. Now, if you set a novel today in a basic doctor's office, you go in, and the first thing I do is comment on an odor. I try to find an odor of antiseptic or something. So I try to go for odor first when somebody enters a room. And then I go for the change in light, which is a touch, because your eyes are affected and they dilate one way or the other. So that's a touch. That's a way to use light as a touch. So if you go into a doctor's examining room, the light gets brighter. So a character will feel his eyes change or her eyes change as entering the room. But apart from that, everybody knows what a doctor's office looks like. And anybody who decides to describe one is a fool. I mean,
right, of course, because like there's only so much difference between all of them.
It's the same. So you just basically say, shiny glass, on the windows of a cabinet, and okay, let's get on with it. But with Creepers and with the Victorian books, or all the ones that deal with the history before the story occurs, that's a gold mine, because it's not only not commonly known, but
Mm.
also it brings a different kind of senses, different quality of sensate that the reader will. Hemingway had an expression that the reader would feel more than understanding, and
Makes
and and
sense.
that
Yeah.
and that's what I try to do, and it's very happy for me when readers, very gracious, kind readers say, I read your book a second time. Oh, God bless you. And it's a different book. It's like there's stuff in there I didn't notice. It's all different. And yes, because once the plot is over, all this other stuff starts to come to the surface.
Well, when you were writing Creepers, what made me think of this is your discussion of your research of Victorian era England. When you were researching and writing Creepers, what did you learn that surprised you?
Um, Well, primarily that this was an international phenomenon. Next to the United States, next to English-speaking countries, the country that went crazy over creepers was Germany. They like 500,000 copies were sold there. I mean, who could predict? And did that have something to do with the sense in Germany of that, that latent history, and all those old bunkers and that some of them haven't even been discovered, that they feel. So that this phenomenon existed, and that when I wrote the book in 2004 for a 2005 publication, I was amazed. The riots in 1968, this was a big influence on my novel, First Blood, the Rambo novel. 1968 was a year in the United States of terror. There were, the assassinations of Martin Luther King and Robert Kennedy, and there were several hundred serious riots. I mean, it's hard to imagine. Almost every major city had its riot. And Detroit was especially hard hit. And now we're talking 50 years later when I'm writing Creepers and I'm looking around doing research, and there were still blocks of downtown Detroit that landlords had abandoned because of the riots and the damage, and still were there. They were still boarded up. Now I'm sure that's different now, all these years later again, nearly 20 years later. And people and urban explorers who had gone into those buildings in 2005 were finding doctors' offices with the patient files still there. We're finding rotary phones. We're finding television
Oh my
sets.
goodness.
Thing was the same
A
with
literal time capsule.
a lot of dust. And so those were some revelations that the effects of that riot, how long it would have taken in order to revitalize some place that had been devastated.
Sure. Well, and also the Creepers makes reference to the race riot that happened in Asbury Park, New Jersey. Is that
Yes.
why is that why you chose Asbury Park as the setting?
When I was looking for, that was happenstance. I thought, oh boy, this is wonderful, this extra. What I was looking for was a resort community on the East Coast that had its glory days, and then gradually had dwindled and dwindled and dwindled, so that its reputation, that was a dim memory. And so by process of elimination, I can't remember what other places I considered or why Asbury Park began to nag at me. But it was essentially its history and its failure, as it were, except that I have to emphasize it's not like that anymore. It came back again. It may have been because Bruce Springsteen, who came from the area, often talked about, playing in these clubs that, that's all there was some of the clubs that there was, it was its own wreckage zone. And it may be because of my interest in Springsteen that I seized on Asbury Park.
Interesting. Well, and you're not the first author to speak with us about Springsteen either. We recently spoke with James Grady,
Yes.
and James is a huge, huge fan of Springsteen.
Yes, and I'm a fan of James. 6 Days of the Condor, which became the film 3 Days of the Condor. And over the years, we had a chance to get together periodically, like-minded authors. And so how thrilling for you to speak to him because, he's a major talent.
Oh, and he was a lovely resource. He was very generous with all of his experiences, as have you been. So, with urban exploration, a lot of what I know, I learned from your book and from the curiosity that it fostered to do my own Google search. There, the people who started it and are committed to it, they treat it the same thing as, say, going to a national park. Take nothing, leave
Yes,
nothing.
that's correct.
Um,
Yes,
do
that's
you
right.
think that that has in any way been diminished by the age of social media? Because I know that with TikTok, there are now a lot of videos about urban exploration, and I'm just wondering if some of that attitude and some of those ethics were in any way diminished by it becoming popular and prominent.
I don't know because the book Creepers was written just before the big internet boom with social media. I mean, there was we had email, but
Mhm.
things that Facebook and Twitter, which were the traditional ones, and then have been eclipsed. Um, I don't think it it wasn't on my mind when I wrote the book, but
Sure,
I
of
don't
course.
think there's anybody who doesn't understand that that social media is not a positive social direction. It has encouraged the worst of us to feel entitled, and so you have some crazy guy, wearing a Nazi hat in the basement, torturing cats, who's putting his opinions out on various social media sites, and they get the same attention in theory as other people who are in their right minds, and so. um, Small segments of people with extreme ideas learn to manipulate social media in order to, I think, devastate our culture. But end of the homily, right? But since you mentioned it, that's my view of it, and I'm sticking with it too.
Well, when the book was written, Urbex, the people who did the infiltrations that you describe in the book were anonymous. How
Yes.
did you find people that were willing to talk with you? Because, that exploration is essentially a crime. I mean, it's
Yes.
it's nothing malevolent about it, or there's no ill intent, but it is illegal to go into a building that doesn't belong to you.
It's trespassing. Moreover, it's dangerous. These places are boarded up, and a lot of the really clever urban explorers seek out city planning, go to the planning department, get the original plans and learn where there might be underground access and things like that. Um, and I tried to make clear, that this is not something to be done lightly, and you could, in fact, have some serious legal consequences to it.
Mhm.
But in terms of the urban exploration, I went to the sites and I simply explained, what I do, and that I wanted to portray them in a way that I felt was responsible and that had, their rules, and talk about the way they did things that they thought were the right way to do things. And they were very available for the larger sites. I think it's been a while now, but I did an interview for at least one site. Wrote an article for another site. We had book giveaways. You have to, it's so to promote.
Sure. Well,
And
and they were your built-in audience, at least in
yes,
part.
exactly. But they were offended by the term creepers. which is a nickname that they don't care for, but which exists.
Mhm.
And so there was a problem there. And I don't know to the degree that I was able to overcome it. But in any case, I got the initial cooperation.
Very
And
cool.
I'm curious about your co-host. Do you have any questions? You're
Yeah.
listening. You've been very patient.
Yeah. Well, thank you. No, I was really fascinated. So I did listen to the book on audio. It didn't occur to me though while I was reading it that it was in real time. I mean, it just didn't. It had that feel to it. Do you feel like there was? I mean, I'm not acquainted with any other novels that do that kind of that had done that real time kind of work. Um, what inspired you to do that? And do you feel like there were drawbacks to it, or did you feel like it was just a real positive experiment
Well,
for you?
it was a challenge, with each book. I've been doing this a long time. My first novel, First Blood, was published in '72, and the average, it's changed a little bit, but for a long time, the average length of a career was 20 years. So why is that? Because the authors tended, having found something that worked, to repeat it again and again and again and again, the same, only different. And then along about the 20-year range, they got tired about the same time as their readers got tired. And I determined it's partly my nature, because I keep thinking, well, what about this and what about that? So my career, so to speak, divides into decades. The first 10 years were essentially outdoor adventure novels. The Rambo novel, Testament. I did a outdoor horror novel called The Totem, which was a lot of fun. In the 80s, I wrote spy novels, and there again, I've always like, how do I make this different? How can I advance the idea? So at the time in the 80s, there were two traditions. There was the UK spy novel, typified by John le Carré, who had been a professional intelligence operative and who wrote novels, Tinker Tinker Soldier Spy, which is my favorite of them, in which the spycraft, as it's called, was absolutely authentic. But you will look a long time to find any action sequence in a John le Carré novel, because that's not the way the business works. It's people in shadowy rooms plotting. Whereas the American spy novel, typified by Robert Ludlum, had all kinds of action, guys in trench coats running down corridors, but shit intelligence techniques. I mean, laughable. So I thought, how do we blend these? Because I was known as an action writer. How can I then blend? And it took a long time because this stuff wasn't written down. But as it happens, former elite military operators tend often to become contract workers in the intelligence world. And so I had a lot of Rambo fans who were that sort of veteran. And so they would teach me the techniques that they learned are what the CIA calls the farm, outside Langley, Virginia. And I didn't learn anything, that was going to topple governments. All I learned was about, traditional intelligence techniques. But at the time in 1984 with Brotherhood of the Rose, this had never been done before. So, that you would have all the running around, and then they talk seriously about, the way espionage worked. And then I did that a second time only for religious espionage, a book called The Fraternity of the Stone. And if you look at Dan Brown's work 20 years later, particularly a book called Angels and Demons, and you look at The Fraternity of the Stone, you will see some amazing parallels.
Yeah, I recall that Opus Dei played a significant nefarious role in your novel.
Yes.
His decades later.
And then it was decades later that he was using it again. And I'm not suggesting he was stealing from me, but there was certainly an influence there. And then in the 90s, I did a different kind of, because the thriller market collapsed with the collapse of the Soviet Union, the intelligence market. So I was thinking of what other way I could do it. And I started writing a couple of books. I did some protective agent books, which is another way to do espionage. And then I did two books in which a photographer and an artist, a painter, in which they are involved in thrillers. One was my version of Rear Window, or of a lot of Hitchcock things, of Vertigo especially. And the other, I don't go down that rabbit hole, but it was a lot of fun to do them. And then in the turn of the century, then I was doing non-supernatural horror, and then later on I was doing the Victorian books, and somehow my readers followed me. And I'm not sure in today's world, where attention spans are closer, are narrower, and where people, I don't know, if you look at the miracle that was supposed to be streaming, where all these adventurous series would be available to, it's all the same. It's even lit the same. I mean, and they're all bloated in the middle. They're longer than they should be. And where did we go? In fact, there's a book recently called Pandora's Box by Peter Biskind about the how network TV became cable TV, became streaming, and how streaming is now a combination of network and cable. And that the adventurous meetings that you would have at the beginning of streaming now sounds like you're dealing with a network back in the 1980s. And it's a wonderful book, Pandora's Box, and it's very revealing about all this. I'm not even sure how I got on that tangent, but it was interesting. So
It was interesting. I'm always interested about writers' processes. So do you write specific times of the day, specific places, or is it more organic than that? Or
what I do,
how was your process?
if this were a question in a writing class, everybody's different. So one of my mentors, the great crime writer Donald E. Westlake, he wrote at night. When the news went off at like 11 or midnight, he wrote until dawn, at least for a time. And everybody's got their own, own rhythm, and his was related to family and things he had to do during the day with the family and things like that. So, day, night, whatever works for you. What works for me is, because I'm primarily a day person, is I get up and I love to read newspapers. I don't like to read digital newspapers because they select for me. And a real newspaper, it's a whole bunch of stuff that I might not ever look at. And as I go across the pages, I learn a lot of interesting things. And then, my wife and I, we chat for a bit, and then I go to my office. And the way my standard day is, I'm hoping to write 5 readable pages. Now, that's a lot, but that's my profession. And if I devote a day to it, I can do it. And it's not automatic writing. And what I say to people who are starting and have families, you can't do 5 pages a day, but if you really want to be a writer, you can do 1 page a day. And you can religiously set aside a portion of that day. Mary Higgins Clark was known to get up at 5 in the morning and write before her kids got up. And before she went to work, I forget what her day job was for a time. And if it's meant to be, if you are to be a writer, you can do 1 page a day. So it's all a question of arranging your schedule, and mine tends to be 5 pages a day. And at the end of the day, I print out. And in the morning, I revise the analog version of the story of whatever I'm working on, not heavily, but you see things differently in print than you do on a screen. And I revise analog, and I do it at a table that is not where I write.
Okay.
because you have to change your perspective. And then I type the revisions into the digital version, and I go on like that. And, and then at the end of a draft, I change the font. If I was writing in Times New Roman, it now becomes Calibri.
Why do you do that?
Again, to see it differently.
Interesting.
Because the page starts to look the same. We have these mental photographs of the pages, and you know what, that's fine, because it's always that way. But as soon as you see it differently, with a different font, it's like a different book. And you say, well, wait a minute, this whole page, every paragraph begins with the same word, however. Well, that isn't right. But it was invisible. Plus, you don't see the whole page on a screen. So there are things like that, just little tricks I have.
Fascinating. Well, they don't
How
seem
much
that
does the
little.
first-
That seems like like that seems like neuroscience to me.
How is that?
Well, just in the sense like the way you're always trying to activate a different part of your
Yeah,
brain.
exactly. Yes, exactly so. And I was going back to the end of the 20-year thing that 25 years now maybe for careers. But I kept my a best-selling author I know who writes the same book with each book, and we know each other. And he said, "What are you doing?" And I told him, and he said, "You son of a bitch, you reinvented yourself again." And not, and as I joked earlier about my wonderful agents, they never know. I say, well, I think I'm going to do a Victorian mystery thriller. Oh, okay, because it's just the way I am.
Yeah. Craig, I think that you had one more question.
Yes, you did. You were saying something.
Yeah.
Oh, sure.
Cinema.
I'm curious. So from the first draft of your novel to the last draft of your novel, how much do those two drafts resemble each other?
There are generally three drafts. I had a friend who was a film editor, and what he loved was coverage. He loved it if the director could give him angles and extra stuff. He'd complain he was doing a car chase and he didn't have enough coverage on the car chase. So he had to, magnify some images and resort to photographs of tires spinning and screeching, which weren't in the coverage either. So I try in the first draft, I tend to have more than I know I'll need. And this can be frustrating because I know it's out of control. But I'm trying to put down while I have it. And then the second draft with a suitable break and a different font, break in time, I'll usually find that, oh, there's too much, and I'll cut back and I'll cut back, and almost always it's wrong. Almost always I've cut too much because a book has to breathe. And so we get into the third draft, which tends to be a happy medium between the overwritten one and the one that is too edited. And usually that's the case. I mean, there are exceptions that where there were more drafts because the book was more difficult. But that's generally the pattern that I follow.
Interesting. Well, David, what do you have coming up next?
Well, what we should talk about the movie about Creepers. I don't know. The movie was optioned to start with in 2006, and the company that owned it just had it an option for a while. It's a wonderful thing. The options, they pay you every 18 months or so, sometimes every year. But they decided they didn't know what to do with it, so they handed it off to another company. So now I had a second run with them, and that company handed it off to a third person, to a company. And that company, the third one, is called SureTone. And that is a company that is directed by a man named Jordan Schur. And Jordan was in the music business for a long time. And so he's bringing his expertise in the music business over, and he tends to use directors of music videos, for example, Mark Klasfeld, I'll say that again, Mark Klasfeld, is the director of Creepers, and he has done all kinds of music videos for very, very distinguished, famous artists. And so I have not seen any footage from the film. It's done. It's been completed, it was finished. I gather at the end of November, and Lionsgate, along with Suretone, is the producer. So we're waiting now for a release date, and that can depend upon a lot of things. And one advantage here is that during COVID, not as many films were made. That we have a completed film at a time when the films are need for the schedule. So we'll see. One of these days, I try not to be at the start when a production begins. Producers are very, they're interested in the author, but once they have the book and once life goes on, you don't hear from them as much. I don't mean that as a knock. It's just the nature of the business, and I try not to be a nuisance. So I haven't gotten in touch with Jordan in a while, and I thought maybe I'll text him one of these days and say, what do we know and how is this going? And it's possible. Someone pointed out to me that on IMDb that the title for the film is not Creepers, it's called Do Not Enter. And I remember Jordan talking to me about this because there had been a lot of discussions about a previous film called Jeepers Creepers, which is fairly well known. And
Yeah, it's a supernatural horror film.
yes. And would Creepers then be mistaken for a re-release of the other movie? I mean, how do you balance all this? So there's a chance that it will have a title change. And I do know that with an echo to the sequel Scavenger, there's that one group of people who are in that old building, as it were, the antagonists to our group of urban explorers, our creepers. They call themselves the Scavengers. So there's there's some playfulness going on here, but I'm looking forward to seeing where Mark took this. I know they shot it in Romania, which has ruins galore.
Mm-hmm.
So I gathered they used a lot of buildings that real life buildings that could stand in for the Paragon Hotel. So I'm looking forward to it. It's it's cool to have movies made.
Yeah, of course. Hmm. Well, before we go, I heard a rumor that your next book is a Western. Is that true?
Yes and no. I in my urge to explore genres, and I have one Western already called Last Reveille, about the Mexican bandit Pancho Villa's raid on a New Mexican border town called Columbus in 1916. And this is hard to believe, but it happened. He raided, and there was a military base there, the cavalry in those days. It was just switching over. And Villa went back into Mexico, and the First World War was going on. And there were some people who thought that Villa might have been a German agent, that this might in fact have been an attack surreptitiously by the Germans, encouraging the bandit. So the United States government met and decided that Pershing of military fame would lead what was called a punitive expedition, which was the original title of the novel, into Mexico, pursuing him. Now, this was an invasion of Mexico, and there were pitched battles with Mexican troops as they tried to figure out, and they never did find him. I think they were very close, from other people later on talking about where Villa had been hiding. And I thought, this is too good to be true. I modeled the last cavalry scout, so to speak, who'd been there for the Indian Wars and all the rest of it. And I saw him as a John Wayne figure, and I modeled the character. And his name was Miles Calendar, Space and Time. Miles Calendar. And that, and that he would be looking back over his career with a young recruit whom he was trying to teach to pass it on, even though all that world was ending. And it was a lot of fun. And so anyway, yes, I started working after the Victorian books on a Western. And the trouble is, everybody thought it was going to be like the Gregory Peck movie, The Bravados, where there's a bank robbery, the sheriff, the marshal's wife is killed, and he losses a posse, and he's going after him. I mean, they thought in the most, as I spoke to people about this, to readers in general, and what I wanted to do was something a little more real, along the lines of True Grit or something like that, and I might go back to it, but I could not make it work the way I want it to. And at the same time, in today's world, make people appreciate it the way I wanted it to. So it's just something that I come back to with regret periodically.
I see. Okay. Well, if you ever finish it, I'm definitely interested.
So one day I might be able to figure out how to do it. But the research was a lot of fun. I'll give you an example. The frontier ended in 1890. That's according to the US government, which stated that the frontier was over on the basis that there were no more homesteads to be given out. And every state or territory had at least 1 million people living in it. Okay? So think of this in terms of the way Westerns in the 1880s are portrayed. Dodge City had a telephone system. Deadwood had a telephone system. Cheyenne, Wyoming had its own electrical system. That these towns had generators outside, so how do you deal with the real West in the 1880s, which was becoming modern so fast that and try to burst that bubble, so to speak, and then at the same time have an authentic Western app. And I'll show you how difficult it is. And I'm a great fan of Taylor Sheridan. All right.
Mhm.
So he had a TV thing. What was it? Yellowstone 1883. Was that what it was called? All right. In Texas, a group of people decide they don't want to live there anymore, and they're going to go to Wyoming or Montana. Okay. And they decided to do it by wagon train. And they're going to encounter all the traditional problems that, say, are in Red River. It's impossible for that to have happened. Every 100 acres, they would have had to ask the homeowners if they could take down the barbed wire for the wagon trains to go through. I mean, there were 10,000 miles of railroad tracks in the West at that time. Why didn't they just get on the train?
Yeah. I had a similar complaint with there's a Christian Bale film called Savages.
Same thing.
Cavalry trying to return an important chief to his home territory. And it's like, we literally could have put him on a train.
And this was the late 1880s, or even I think after.
I think that was set in the 1890s. Yeah.
Right. When I mean, and there they are, with their little tents and all, and they're riding. And I mean, the barbed wire would have been every 100 acres. It wasn't possible. And people talked about how authentic it felt. Nonsense. And I mean, I don't want to take away from the skill with which these things are made, but there's a flaw in the research for the concept now for 1883, it might have worked in the 1870s, but the fact was the wagon train era was before the Civil War.
I was going to say they had an 1880s story, but it was really set in the 1850s.
Yeah, exactly so. And this is, I mean, it's possible. The trouble is then you don't get modern weapons in the 1850s. You don't get repeating rifles and handguns. And now it's all, who wants to see somebody, fooling around with all the powder and all that? I mean, talk about boring.
I mean, I want to see it, but I'm probably a niche market.
Yeah, but I mean, the wagon train era was before the Civil War. The railroad era was after, and the same thing with the Pony Express. It lasted 1 year. I think it was in 1861, and it simply wasn't viable. You needed stations every 20 miles minimum, and you needed all the remounts going this way and that way. There's I mean, if you look at it, it's like a massive undertaking to have all those stations and all those horses, and it's no wonder it didn't work. Plus, the telegraph existed,
right,
and the trains existed. Put the damn nail on the train, and it'll get there.
Yeah,
Great fun.
Well, David, thank you so much for being here. I really appreciate your taking time out of your schedule to talk to us about creepers.
Oh, I had fun. It was fun to go through all these other things. We ranged far afield, but it's still. I guess when I taught literature, I used to tell my students, I said, I don't expect you to remember everything I said, because that would be impossible. But I do hope that you will remember my attitude. My enthusiasm for what I do, and the enthusiasm other people should have, and the sense of inventiveness and looking for new ways, that it's all there's an openness ahead of us. And so, if people go away from our conversation with a kind of increased enthusiasm for their reading or their writing, because I know authors visit you, or what they do in life. But as we're all aware, there are a lot of people who are dead and they just don't know it. They're walking around, but they died about 10 years ago, and they somehow they're like walking rocks. They've been so ossified, and we have to not have that happen. We have to find ways to keep limber.
Oh yeah. Well, I can't think of a better description to end a discussion of creepers on.
Oh, being dead for 10 years?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, thank you everyone for listening. As always, support your local used bookstore. As always, read books and read David Morell's books.
Oh, by all means. And my website is davidmorell.net, as in the network of readers. And it's a lot of stuff on it.
Lovely. Well, thank you very much, David.
Thank you. Nice to meet you both.
And that's our show. 2 pieces of housekeeping. First, this is the penultimate episode of season 1. So this is the second to the last episode. We'll have one more coming up, and then I'm going to take a short hiatus to plan some more episodes and read more books. Also, since we talked with David Morell, John Barth actually did pass away. So if you're not familiar with his work or career, I encourage you to consult Google. Thanks for listening.
Neighborhood Bookstore was created and hosted by Eric Harper. Visit us at ericharperpresents.substack.com for free episodes, transcripts, and all the latest news. You can also find us on YouTube and anywhere fine audio podcasts are published. Today's guest host was Craig Duster, owner and head ne'er-do-well at Pop Art Books Culture. When in Boardman, Ohio, please visit Pop Art Books Culture at 6949 Market Street, Boardman, Ohio 44512. www.popabcstore.com. This episode was produced by Eliza Osborne and Eric Harper. Executive producer, Julie Cancio Harper. Narration by Adam Fetterman.